Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be coming to you almost live, I guess, from Integra headquarters, also known as my dining room table, to talk to you about some pretty exciting news that we had to announce to the market today. So we announced today that we're resuming drilling in Idaho after a 6-week break. Obviously, we had to take some time off to do our part to flatten the curve. However, we will be resuming drilling by May 20th. And with all of the appropriate COVID protection measures in place to protect not only our people, but the contractors that we'll be using. So we're really, really happy and excited to be getting back to drilling in Idaho. And we're going straight for the throat of the best targets that we have to test this year, which are Florida Mountain high-grade targets, which I will take you through through this presentation. Really excited about what's to come. We've got one drill rig that will be focusing on Florida Mountain to start, a second drill rig that will be added to Florida Mountain probably early June, and then sometime in July, a third drill rig to be brought in to the campaign to start at the other high-grade property that we have, which is War Eagle. I'll be making a few forward-looking statements today, more than a few, as most of you know me by now. That's what I do. And now zooming straight into a drone view of Florida Mountain. And so we're looking now at Florida Mountain side on. We're looking straight due east, which means that north is in this direction, is trace the boundaries of the deposit. Basically what's known about the 1.1 million, or the extent of the 1.1 million ounces. Essentially, it's everything from the top of this ridge down to a rough depth of about 100 odd meters from surface. And so we know a lot about what's going on in the first 100 meters. We don't know much about what's going on below that, but we've got a pretty good hunch about what's going on down there, which we'll get to in a sec. So a pretty interesting thing happened through the course of last year's drill program. So we were busy drilling a number of fences of drill holes across the top of the mountain in an effort to collect sample material for the feasibility study, basically further proving the amenability of the oxide and the transitional layers of this deposit to heap leaching. And in the course of doing so, a couple interesting things came to pass in the metallurgical drilling. So those of you who would have followed our news releases over the course of last year would have seen our successive releases of some pretty high-grade intercepts in the course of drilling at the top of the mountain in the oxide and the transitional layer. So what we found is through a number of these drill intercepts, we were intersecting some spectacular grades of these vein zones that was lining up really well with what we had interpreted these high-grade zones to be when they hit the surface of this deposit. So basically, we found evidence of these high-grade zones coming to surface in the upper volcanics that host the low-grade disseminated deposit. So really, really interesting stuff. Now, where it gets seriously interesting is when you start to look at how these vein zones are oriented. They're oriented basically north-south, dipping very steeply to the west. These zones line up extremely well with what we had compiled from the data that we obtained from historical records of past mining underneath the mountain. Essentially, these vein zones, these high-grade zones, were lining up extremely well with what we knew the extent of these veins to be when mined by the old-timers at depth. These vein zones are quite extensive, in some cases a couple kilometers in length. There are some really, really monstrous stopes that were mined on one vein in particular underneath the mountain. A really interesting thing happens when I start to rotate this image around for you. I'm going to do it slowly. But what you see here, dotting the countryside, is these piles of dirt here. And so these piles of dirt that you see along the side of this hill are essentially the entry points, or the adits that were put into the side of the mountain by the old timers in the late 1800s that were used to access the underground portions of this deposit where they mine these spectacular grades. And when I say spectacular grades, historically, we're talking about 15 gram per ton cutoff. We're talking about grades 30, 60 grams per ton gold underground. And there is a real abundance of these workings that go into the side of the hill. So back into the digital world of that part of the countryside, and I'm going to zoom in on that right now. So what you're looking at now is Florida Mountain itself. As I mentioned, it sits at the apex of the ridge, and what you're seeing there is the red mineralization that you see there. That's essentially what we've interpreted the oxide mineralization to be, amenable to open pit heap leach extraction. The green that you see there is transitional material. Again, fair game from a heap leach perspective. And we're just going to look under the hood here. I'm going to rotate that slowly. And the blue mineralization that you see there is essentially the sulfide mineralization, which will be treated in the 2,000 ton per day mill that we had planned as per the PEA. Zooming out, and I'm going to pull into this here and zoom in on that. And so what we're looking at here is basically the top-down view of the Florida Mountain deposit. These yellow surfaces that you see here are the vein zones that have been interpreted from our exploration crew's compilation work. And let's look at what these vein zones look like when you look straight down the guts of the deposit. So essentially what we're looking at right now is a view straight north, okay? So what we're looking at here is a sectional view of the deposit, if you will. This is the lower reaches of what we know the deposit to be right there, the lower limits. So from the surface, from the apex of the hill, down to about 100 meters, you know, we know a fair bit about what's going on there because it's been fairly extensively drilled. However, from the lower limit of the deposit, from there down to about 350 meters depth, we don't know much. There's nothing in the way of drilling that goes down that deep. So the reason why we're so excited about what's to come over the month of May, June, and into July, we're setting up our drill rigs essentially at the top of the mountain here on various levels, side of the hill, and we're going to be drilling down into the regions where we know the old timers drilled. We know that they extracted from record a serious amount of high-grade gold and silver in the form of these veins. And so therein lies the target. That's that connection between what we intersected this last winter, essentially, and the lower reaches of the deposit, basically those feeder zones that fed fluid into this low sulfidation system. This is another thing that gets us really, really jazzed up about what's going on out there. So we did soil geochem work over the top of this deposit, an extensive amount. As a matter of fact, this is something that had never been done by anybody else in the past. In an effort to qualify the signature, the geochemical signature that's associated with Florida Mountain, just to see, you know, what it looks like in the soil. And so what you might not be able to see there, but I can see it because my screen is higher resolution. I'm going to trace it out for you. Essentially what I've just traced out there is the surface expression of 1.1 million ounces of Florida Mountain gold equivalent. However, the anomaly that's associated with Florida Mountain is that. That's the geochemical signature of Florida Mountain. I think you'll agree that you can fit several Florida Mountains into the entire surface expression of this anomaly. I should say that outside of these boundaries, there's very little, if anything, in the way of drilling that's been done historically. So therein lies the target for us. Florida Mountain is going to get bigger, according to what we believe.